If you were made to eat a meal in the Middle Ages, you might not even be able to swallow the first bite. In our imagination, an ancient European banquet is roast meat on long tables and red wine flowing freely, but that's a lie. The real picture is the bread in your hand, possibly bulked out with half sawdust and chalk dust. That stew that looks so high-end is, in fact, smothered in heavy spices to desperately cover up the rancid, putrefying stench it has long since developed. And as for quenching your thirst, you can only drink like mad, because in that era, water was for pigs. For a person to take a sip of raw water often meant death. Tonight, we're going to tear that romantic filter to shreds. In this barbarous world with no refrigerators, no MSG, and not even potatoes or chili peppers, food isn't just bad, it's a weapon, it's poison, it's even a nauseating form of medical treatment. Why did King John of England drop dead after eating a few peaches? Why did monasteries deliberately boil vegetables to mush? Why could black bread drive an entire village collectively mad? Our story begins with the bread in your hand. You sit in a dimly lit room, tossing the chunk of rye bread that serves as your staple. It's heavy, its crust as rough as sandpaper. You tear off a piece and cram it into your mouth. After a couple of chews, a teeth-aching scraping sound echoes inside your skull. The tip of your tongue can clearly feel tiny, sharp grit grinding against your enamel. This was a common problem with medieval flour. The mills of the time, whether driven by rushing water or turning veins, ultimately had to force two massive millstones, weighing several tons, to grind against each other. To crush the grain, the miller had to regularly chisel deep grooves into the stone's surface with an iron pick to increase friction. As the mill turned, not only did the wheat become flour, the millstone itself began to crumble. Fine quartz chips and the metal filings left by the chisel all ended up mixed into the flour. Those bits were far harder than teeth, and day after day they wore people's teeth down into smooth craters, sometimes grinding straight through to the dental nerves, but at least that was still the good outcome. If you were unlucky, this bread might not even contain much grain at all. In medieval towns, bread was sold by weight to skim profit from expensive flour. Bakers used viciously unscrupulous tricks. Late at night, when kneading dough, they would mix in sawdust swept up from sawmills to increase volume, and add ground dried beans or even white sticky clay from the riverbank to increase weight. Some loaves, once cut open, had an unnaturally pale cross-section, or a musty taste of moldy wood chips when chewed. Every mouthful you swallow isn't just wearing down your teeth, it's scraping your intestines and stomach as well. This kind of fraud infuriated everyone. The law had specific, humiliating punishments for it. If a baker was caught short-weighting or adulterating bread, they would be tied to a filth-covered sled and dragged through the streets for public shaming, or hauled to the city square and locked into a fixed wooden pillory with head and hands trapped, unable to move like a living target. The sawdust-laced bread would be hung around their neck while furious townspeople hurled rotten vegetable leaves and mud at them. Still, sawdust and fecal bits would at most leave you with toothache or stomach pain. In those years of relentless rain, if you noticed even a faint purplish speckling in your rye bread, that was when the real nightmare began. Turn the clock back to the 14th century. Europe's sky seemed perpetually gray. This was the era known as the Little Ice Age. Temperatures plunged, and more than half the year was rain. Wheat fields sat soaked in icy mud year-round, and the harvested rye often carried a damp, moldy odor. When you break open a loaf baked from that rye, you might see slender purple-black grains mixed inside, embedded in the dough like mouse droppings. Faced with hunger, most people would pick them out or simply shut their eyes and swallow them. That is ergot, a highly toxic fungus that parasitizes damp rye, and also a powerful hallucinogen. After you eat bread contaminated with this mold, at first you may only feel a slight prickling in your fingertips, as if singed by fire. But soon that burning sensation spreads through your limbs and across your whole body, as though your blood has turned into flowing lava. People at the time, terrified, called the illness St. Anthony's fire. Then the hallucinations begin. Picture an entire village poisoned at once. The usually obedient farmer suddenly sprinting along the ridge between fields, screaming that demons are chasing them. Housewives writhing naked in the streets, claiming they've seen angels descend. Someone convulsing wildly on the ground, foaming at the mouth. And that isn't even the worst part. The toxin violently constricts blood vessels, completely cutting off blood supply to the limbs. After the carnival of hallucinations comes what awaits them: gangrene. The poisoned person's fingers, toes, even an entire arm slowly turn black and shrivel, dropping off the body like charcoal, and the whole process leaves not a single drop of blood. Most despairing of all, in an age without microscopes, no one knew that moldy rye was to blame. Watching a whole village slip into madness and mutilation, people could only surge into churches in fear, believing it was God's punishment or a witch's curse. They knelt before statues to pray, then turned back to the table, slicing open that rye loaf with purple specks and feeding it to their equally hungry children. That was the medieval gamble for survival. You never knew whether this bite would fill your stomach or open the door to a hallucinatory trip into hell. This mixture of dependence on bread and fear of it caused this most basic food to mutate completely in the hands of different classes. For peasants struggling on the edge of survival, it was dangerous fuel. But inside the high walls of castles, for nobles who never worried about hunger, bread wasn't even for eating, it was for using as a plate. At a typical noble banquet, you would see a strange phenomenon. The table is piled with roast meats and stews, yet there are no plates. Instead, in front of each guest sits a square brown object. It looks like a plank, feels like a plank, and makes a plank-like sound when tapped on the table, but in reality, it's a piece of stale bread that's been left out for more than 4 days. This was the medieval plate, called a trencher. In an age when ceramics were expensive and wooden bowls hard to wash, people invented this disposable tableware. Cooks deliberately baked an extremely dense loaf, using the coarsest whole wheat flour, then cut it into thick slices and left them to dry in a ventilated place for a full 4 days. By then, the bread's hardness rivaled building materials so hard even rats couldn't gnaw it. But its purpose wasn't to be eaten. It was to absorb grease. A piece of roast venison, dripping with scorching fat, would be tossed directly onto this breadboard by a servant, and thick meat juices, sauces, and blood would immediately seep into the bread's pores. As the feast went on, the once rock-hard plate gradually softened and discolored, becoming a sponge saturated with mixed liquids. To the nobles seated in the place of honor, this grease-soaked bread was waste. When the feast ended, they would casually throw these sticky plates on the floor to feed the dogs, or gather them up and distribute them like handing out trash as alms to the poor outside the castle. Here, a cruel class cycle took shape. When the bread was hard as a slab, it belonged to the nobles. Its value was its hardness as tableware. The nobles consumed its function, using it to carry their abundant meat. But when it had been soaked soft and rotten with gravy, grease, and saliva, only then did it belong to the poor. Its value became the bread itself. What the poor consumed was that tiny bit of flavor and calories that leaked down between the noble's fingers. So this bread plate is the truest portrait of medieval class. Its hardness served power. Its soggy collapse was the only charity the poor could ever receive. And yet, a trencher was at least made of flour. On that table full of deceit, there was an even more deceptive shell. It looked like delicious pastry, but in fact it was one of the earliest preservatives of the Middle Ages. If you bought a meat pie at a medieval market, don't bite into it in one big mouthful the way you would today. The only result would be snapping off your front teeth. The pies we know today have flaky crusts in layers and melt in the mouth. But centuries ago, this outer crust had an even more chilling name: coffin. The word carried no horror then. It simply meant a hard container. There was no plastic wrap and no refrigerator to keep meat longer. Cooks came up with a simple, brutal method: flour and water. Not a drop of oil, kneaded into a dense dough like clay. The dough was shaped into a tub or box, stuffed with chunks of meat, spices, and large amounts of butter, then baked for a long time. In the process, the several centimeter thick crust would bake hard as iron, sealing the inside completely like concrete. This wasn't really food. It was an edible can. The hard shell blocked air and bacteria. The meat filling inside could keep for days at room temperature, even weeks, without spoiling. When you were ready to eat, the correct method wasn't to slice it open, but to smash the top like cracking a walnut, or pry the side open violently with a knife. At that moment, a powerful smell sealed up for a long time would rush into your face. If it was freshly baked, it was the aroma of meat. If it had been sitting for weeks, that instant of smell might become unforgettable for the rest of your life. As for the coffin crust itself, the container under normal circumstances, it was thrown away. Only in extreme famine would the poor pick up these rock-hard crusts soaked through with rancid grease, boil them in soup for hours, until they were barely chewable. So when you see knights in films swaggering as they take huge bites of meat pie, remember, that's modern screenwriters' imagination. The real scene is that they first have to chisel open the hard casing with a dagger, scoop out the minced meat inside, and then toss the outer shell called a coffin to the hunting hounds under the table. If those weapon-like breads and crusts were still testing the limits of people's teeth, what comes next takes us into an even more hidden and filthy realm. In this place, the passage of time is no longer an abstract concept. It becomes something concrete: an unwashed pot and a cauldron of thick soup spanning life and death. Welcome to the murky medieval kitchen. Dim, smoke-choked, the air always filled with a sour, rotten smell you can't quite name. The source of that smell is the pitch-black iron pot hanging over the hearth. This pot is the heart of the household, and the final station for every ingredient. It has a rather romantic-sounding name: everlasting soup. But don't be fooled. The everlasting doesn't refer to a rolling richness of flavor. It means the soup was never fully finished and the pot was never washed. In an age when firewood was precious, relighting a fire was an extravagant affair. So a peasant family's hearth fire burned year-round, and the soup in the pot simmered year-round too. Tonight's leftovers stay as the base. Tomorrow morning you throw in a few handfuls of cabbage, a handful of beans if you're lucky enough to catch a rabbit or find a dead bird. That goes straight in as well. It's a cooking relay of infinite refills. The ladleful you scoop today might be mixed with carrots pulled up yesterday, salted meat left from last week, even scraps of pig bone boiled to mush a month ago. New ingredients constantly cover old ones. New flavors constantly mask the taste of decay. That pot is like a time black hole. It swallows everything edible and boils it down into a brown, sticky paste with a muddled, indistinct flavor. For medieval peasants, it was efficient survival wisdom. The rolling boil killed bacteria to some extent, and the soft mush was easier for elders whose teeth had long been worn down. But to modern eyes, it's practically a live biological experiment, because you never know how many years of residue have settled in that bottomless pot. Perhaps when you drink that warm, thick soup, Your taste buds are having an intimate, time-traveling contact with last year's dinner. If this thousand-year soup was merely strange tasting, at least it was warm and liquid. But on the medieval table, there was another way of handling meat. To fight time's corrosion, people had to sacrifice the most basic dignity of food water. In the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as fresh meat in the modern sense. Once autumn arrived, to save feed for winter, herds of animals were slaughtered all at once. But faced with mountains of meat, in a world without refrigerators, to keep it from becoming a paradise for maggots, people had to use a simple, brutal chemical weapon: salt. This wasn't careful curing like today's ham making. It was a violent sentence of dehydration. In an oak barrel taller than a person, a thick layer of coarse salt. A layer of bloody raw meat, pressed down like that, layer after layer, until the barrel was packed. Or you would throw an entire pork leg into brine so concentrated that an egg could float, and under extreme osmotic pressure, the water in the meat was forcibly drawn out. The muscle fibers shrank and hardened, ultimately turning into a deep red, rock-hard dried chunk. When you wanted to eat a piece of meat like that, the challenge was only just beginning. Eating it directly was impossible. The saltiness would not only burn your tongue, it could even be enough to send your kidneys into sudden failure. It was hard like a piece of pickled old tree bark. Even a knife couldn't cut it. So the only method was a long resurrection ritual: desalting. The cook had to throw this stone-like salted meat into a flowing stream, or soak it in a large basin. Every few hours, the water had to be changed, for a full day and night. In the process, as the salt slowly leached out, all the hemoglobin and meat juices that once gave it savory flavor were washed away as well. What finally came to the table was a gray-white, loose bundle of fibers. It looked like a rag that had been soaked and swollen with water. No meat flavor. No salt flavor. When you bit into it, there was only a wet, fibrous texture and a lingering, stale, briny, sodden smell that wouldn't go away. That's why medieval recipes are always full of heavy sauces. The cook had to use large amounts of vinegar, mustard, even expensive spices, to give these meats already dead twice, once by slaughter and once by salt and smoke, the illusion of a little taste again. In that era, to resist time's tyranny, people had to sacrifice all texture and deliciousness. And in such a suffocating cooking environment, it wasn't only diners' taste buds that suffered, so did the living tools in the kitchen. If you stepped into a lord's kitchen, what greeted you first wasn't fragrance, but a wave of stifling heat. Before that open hearth that seemed capable of swallowing a whole cow, a cruel performance of physical endurance was being staged. To roast an entire pig or sheep evenly, the spit had to turn constantly over the fire, stop for even a moment, and one side would burn while the other remained raw. This dull and grueling job fell to the lowest creatures in the kitchen. The turnspit boy, or specially bred turnspit dogs. A 7 or 8-year-old child, or a short-legged, long-bodied little dog, was shut inside a wooden cage like a hamster wheel. Through gears, the cage connected to the roasting spit on the hearth. To keep that roast pig weighing dozens of gin, tens of pounds, turning without stopping, they had to run tirelessly in the cage for hours on end, while the blaze in the hearth roared just a few meters away. No insulation, no ventilation. For these living engines, it wasn't merely labor, it was high-heat torture. If you leaned in to observe that suckling pig turning on the spit, you would notice some stomach-turning details. From the extreme heat and violent exertion, the turnspit boy would be soaked through. Sweat dripped constantly from forehead and cheeks, and directly below them was often the sizzling roast. Those drops of sweat, mixed with soot, skin flakes, and bodily fluids, would fall, one by one, onto the crisp pig skin, instantly evaporating, becoming an unspoken secret seasoning for the feast. Not to mention the ash flying around in that completely unshielded, smoke-filled kitchen. The dust shaken loose from old beams overhead, even the occasional fly that would get stuck to the glittering layer of fat and become part of the roast's surface. To the nobles seated in the banquet hall, it was a delicacy: crisp skin, tender meat. But to the turnspit boy in the kitchen, running until collapse, it was the taste of hell. Like a donkey tethered to a millstone, they ran endlessly beside the flames, just so every bite of meat on the table would be cooked to perfection. And yet, even this roast, mixed with sweat and soot, was an unattainable dream for most people. At certain times of the year, what was truly terrifying wasn't how dirty the food was, but that there was no food to eat at all. We always assume winter was the hardest season for medieval peasants, but that wasn't the case. In early winter, livestock had just been slaughtered. Cellars were piled with smoked meat and grain. If you rationed carefully, life could still go on. The real hell descended in early spring, when everything was beginning to revive a deadly season known as the Hunger Gap. By then, last year's stores were already running out. The last salted bone in the cellar had been gnawed white, while the new season's crops had only just been planted. Not even green shoots had emerged yet. For peasants who lived at the mercy of the weather, it was a vacuum period as long as 2 months. After the last sack of flour was eaten, people began searching this newly green world for anything that could fill the stomach. First came beans, those dried peas that in ordinary times were considered gas-inducing and fit only for the poor, now became true lifesavers. When even the beans were gone, people turned their eyes to the forest. Women collected acorns, although bitter and hard to swallow and full of tannins that could cause severe constipation and kidney damage if eaten in quantity. Once ground into flour and baked into cakes, at least they looked like food. Children were sent to strip bark, especially the inner bark of elm and pine, because it was the only source of carbohydrates. Grinding those dry, hard strips of bark and mixing them with sawdust or dirt to make bread, you would find it didn't even make you feel full. Instead, it would sink in your stomach like a stone, leaving you in agony. In the most desperate years, during the Great Famine of 1013-15, for example, chronicles left chilling records. People began digging up graves or staring greedily at corpses that had starved by the roadside. In the face of extreme hunger, morality and humanity were as fragile as that thin bark bread. This hunger was not an exception. It was a cyclical torment, endured every year. For ordinary medieval people, tasting bad was never something to consider. Whether bitter acorns or dirt-mixed bark, as long as it provided a little heat and let you stay alive until the first harvest came in, it was a delicacy granted by God. If the poor person's table was hard to swallow because of scarcity, then inside the high walls of castles, the nobles with inexhaustible wealth were actively manufacturing another kind of inedible we can hardly understand. Push open the doors of the noble banquet hall, and the first thing that hits your nose isn't the aroma of meat, but a blended stench so intense it feels suffocating. The pungency of cinnamon, the sharp bite of cloves, the hot sting of ginger, the medicinal note of saffron. These smells tangle together, as if you've walked not into a dining hall, but into a Chinese apothecary that eats fire. If you were lucky enough to taste a bite of that stew, your modern palate might collapse on the spot. You'd find the meat was sweet, violently sweet, then peppery heat, vinegar's sourness, and ginger's sharp bite would explode on your tongue all at once. It wouldn't feel like eating meat at all. It would feel more like chewing a piece of gingerbread soaked in cardboard thin syrup. This was the medieval noble taste, the tyranny of spices. In that era, spices weren't just seasonings. They were symbols of money, status, even health. Pepper was counted and priced by the individual peppercorn. Saffron was worth more than gold. For nobles, the most direct way to display wealth and pursue health was to scatter these expensive powders from the east into food, as though they were free sand. Cooks didn't care about preserving the original flavor of ingredients or creating layers of taste. Their logic was brutally simple. The more expensive the dish, the better. So a simple stewed chicken might include cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, galangal, and a dozen other spices, and finally be dusted with a handful of expensive cane sugar. This style of cooking was called a nouveau riche explosion of taste. Dishes lost their original identity. Everything tasted like the same chaotic, cloying, spicy sweetness. A royal cookbook of the time recorded a classic, noble dish. Boil beef until soft, chop it fine, mix it with red wine. Sugar, cloves, cinnamon, ginger, saffron, almond milk, and finally simmer it into a pot of brown paste. To modern people, it would be a disaster. But in the Middle Ages, that mouthful wasn't taste. It was the trade surplus of the entire East Indies. Hard cash flowing across your tongue. Yet behind this madness of over-seasoning, beyond naked bragging, there was an even more absurd reason. An iron command from ancient medicine, which declared outright that if you didn't balance the properties of food, every bite you ate might be poisoning you. So when a medieval cook covered tender fish with white sugar and cinnamon, they weren't cooking, they were saving your life. According to the humoral theory originating in ancient Greece and Rome, which ruled Western medicine for more than 1,000 years, the human body was made up of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Every ingredient had its own nature. Fish lived in water and therefore belonged to the extremely wet and cold. If eaten without treatment, this wet-cold chi would disrupt the body's balance, leading to illness and even death. To neutralize this toxicity, it had to be paired with seasonings that were dry and hot. What is most dry and hot? The answer was sugar and spices. Thus, in the Middle Ages, sugar was not a flavoring at all. It was medicine. Cooks calculated the medicinal balance of each dish like pharmacists. Beef was dry and cold, so it should be cooked with wet and hot onions. Pork was wet and hot, so it should be roasted with dry and cold vinegar. This logic of treating the kitchen like a dispensary produced countless dark dishes that make modern people nauseous. But that still wasn't the worst. For another group, food being bad wasn't only for health, it was to preserve chastity. Step into a medieval monastery, and you'll find the meals there are practically a public execution of appetite. Vegetables were deliberately boiled into colorless mush. Even on days when meat was allowed, the meat would be boiled in water until it had no taste at all, and any pungent spices were strictly forbidden. This wasn't because of poverty, it was because of fear. In theologians' eyes, hot spices like pepper, ginger, and cinnamon, and red meat full of blood were powerful aphrodisiacs. Once eaten, monks and nuns, who were originally calm and abstinent, would feel their blood boil, and in the night develop unclean bodily impulses. To prevent this, monasteries invented a physical libido-killing way of cooking, using the most monotonous, the most bland, the hardest to swallow foods to seal up human desire for food, and thereby strangle the body's desires. Here, tasting bad was a spiritual discipline. Tastelessness like chewing wax was the ticket to heaven. And yet, there was an interesting contradiction behind it. While monasteries publicly advocated dietary asceticism, they were also the era's highest temples of agriculture, brewing, and cheesemaking. Many beer, liqueur, and cheese recipes in today's civilized world were born precisely within these walls of abstinence. They trained monks' will with bland food, while in their estates and workshops they created the finest drinks and foods of the age. However, for ordinary people, even without so many theological taboos, the table faced a more practical predicament. Some flavors, no matter how much money you had, you could never taste in that era. In medieval Europe, you couldn't eat French fries, you couldn't eat malatang, you couldn't even make the simplest tomato and egg stir-fry. What we consider the soul of Western food today were all imports brought from the Americas centuries later. On medieval maps, the American continents were still blank. That meant the dining table of the time contained a huge black hole of taste. No chili peppers, Sichuan chili oil, Mexican hot sauce, none of it existed. The poor, craving a little heat, could only gnaw on spicy mustard root or horseradish. The rich could only rely on expensive black pepper. No potatoes. The high-yield crop that later fed all of Europe hadn't appeared yet. Peasant staples could only be monotonous bread and gas-inducing beans. Most deadly of all, no tomatoes. Can you imagine pasta without tomato sauce? Or pizza without a red tomato base? Italian cuisine then was so pale, it breaks your heart. So in this monotonous world lacking sweet and sour complexity and painful stimulation, what did cooks rely on to lift flavor? The answer was sour, extremely sour. Before lemons became widespread, vinegar and a liquid called unripe grape juice ruled everything. This sour juice pressed from green grapes had a sharp, pungent bite. Yet, it was the era's core seasoning. Whether roast meat, stews, or sauces, cooks would pour it in without hesitation. To make up for the monotony of ingredients, they also invented complex sweet and sour flavors, for example. Mixing vinegar, sugar, dried fruits, and spices into a sauce like today's sweet and sour, but 10 times more intense, then pouring it over anything edible. This led to an awkward situation. Medieval dishes were either tasteless boiled water food or heavy flavors drowned in vinegar and spices. In an age where the palate of taste was severely missing, cooks could only hammer furiously on 3 keys: sour, sweet, salty, trying to play something that resembled a tune. Since flavor was destined to be monotonous, nobles turned their attention to another dimension. If a dish didn't taste good, then make it produce a deceptive shock visually. If you were invited to a medieval royal banquet, don't believe the colors your eyes see. In that era, a dish had not only to be edible, it had to glow. For nobles, taste was secondary. Making money's gleam shine under candlelight was what mattered. This was the core aesthetic of medieval cooking: gilding. Gold symbolized divinity and wealth. To give roast chicken, stews, even rice pudding that noble hue, cooks used large amounts of saffron, not only a spice, but the most expensive dye in the world. And in more extreme occasions, such as a king's reward banquet, cooks would even hammer real gold into ultra-thin leaf and paste it directly onto the surface of a whole roast pig. Besides gold, red was also the color of power. But to dye that deep blood-like crimson, simple berry juice obviously wasn't strong enough. Some cooks eager to please their lord would secretly use sandalwood powder, or even the highly toxic mineral pigment cinnabar, mercury sulfide, to achieve the effect. Yes, you heard that right. To make jelly look brighter, they didn't hesitate to add mercury-containing mineral pigments. This wasn't merely cooking. It was painting on a plate with poisonous paint. Some recipes of the time even included a dish called Last Judgment. Shaping minced meat into devils and angels, dyeing the devils black with squid ink, dyeing the angels gold with saffron, and arranging them into a huge religious tableau. When such a dish was served, it was often already cold. The flavor became strange and bitter because of all the coloring. But that didn't matter. When the platter was carried into the hall and drew gasps from guests, its mission was already fulfilled. At a medieval table, food was first spectacle, second fodder. Whether it tasted good didn't matter. What mattered was whether it looked expensive enough, whether it looked like a hallucination. Now, let this distant journey of taste, archaeology, gently draw to a close. Let the castle's clamor, the kitchen smoke, the banquet's din all fade slowly from your mind with my voice. At this moment, You are lying safely in your own time. Here. There is no bread mixed with sawdust. No filthy water that must be replaced by alcohol. No survival-driven distortion of taste. That 1,000-year-long, struggle-filled history of civilization turned to its final page, and you are the peaceful ending. So sleep easy. Good night.